This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, January 1802, President Thomas Jefferson writes a letter to members of the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Association in which he references that the First Amendment of the Constitution effectively sets up a, quote, wall of separation between church and state. And it's from that letter that we get what is one of the core and most contested ideas in American political and religious life, this idea of a separation between church and state. And we will get into how it's been contested and interpreted and how that phrase says as much about Jefferson's religious beliefs and political calculations as much as anything. It is worth noting that a couple days after writing this letter, what did Jefferson do? Well, he attended a church service, and not just a church service, but one that was held literally inside the House of Representatives. So maybe that tells us a little something about what separation between these two bodies meant to him. But here to discuss that letter and the origins of the church-state divide is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And we should say that Kelly Carter-Jackson is not with us today. She had knee surgery to ring in the new year. What a wonderful way to mark a new year. But she is at home.
New knees.
Exactly. She's at home recovering. We wish her well, but she will be back soon. But it's just Nikki and I today. And you ready to play religious scholar, constitutional scholar? We're in the deep end with this one a little bit.
Oh, yeah. People will have thoughts on this.
People have thoughts on it.
Are you ready for your inbox?
Including thoughts on the, erased marginalia in Jefferson's letter, which became a whole thing in the 90s where people, like any text. But I suppose we should start with this very basic thing that I think will surprise people maybe and is of note. But, that idea, the separation between church and state, people say, oh, that's what the First Amendment did, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. But that actual language, that word separation, it isn't in the First Amendment. It is in this letter that interprets the First Amendment that Jefferson wrote some years after.
That is exactly right. So if you are a textualist in your constitutional interpretations, you have no truck with the separation of church and state. I'm sure all of our listeners have their pocket constitutions. If you pull them out, you will not find this phrase. And yet, I think it really has been the reigning metaphor for how people think about the religion clause in the First Amendment, right? That there must be a separation between church and the government, which has been interpreted in a lot of different ways, as we will get into, including, in this case, state meant the federal government. This is before the 14th Amendment. The Constitution and its amendments only apply to the federal government and not to the states. So, this is a period in which it's a very small wall, I guess, between church and state, or at least our understanding of what each is very different today.
Well, you could say that for every single word that he wrote. I was curious which one you were going to glom onto, but you went with state, but it's like, what does wall mean? What does separation mean? What does church mean? What does state mean? And what did they mean at that time versus the very many ways they've been interpreted since. But, we should talk about Jefferson's personal religious views and positioning, because they, I think, obviously reflect the words that he chose here. But let's talk about what's in the Constitution versus what's in this letter, and maybe, what we make of those two. So the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Well, and we should talk about what that means. When it's talking about the establishment of a religion, it's coming from a point in time when in both England and English common law and in the United States, governments established churches. Like there was a favored church in various states. Obviously, this had been a big deal in England as well in this period. And that idea that the government would establish a favored church was pretty normal. And it's kind of a radical idea coming out of that tradition to say, actually, no, Congress is not going to be establishing a church. You need to figure that out on the local level, what church you will establish. And so it is this kind of idea that there should be some pluralism when it comes to religion, at least on the federal level.
And I think Jefferson lived that, right? Jefferson was a deist, right? He wrote, that we could do a whole episode on this, but, he reportedly made his own version of the Bible. People say he wrote his own Bible. He actually more just kind of remixed the Bible, right?
Just cut out some words.
Yeah, he cut out some words, but he tended to cut out the sort of more mystical, magical stuff and made it more into a, I don't know, kind of like Ben Franklin-esque aphorisms for living kind of thing, He was very into Jesus as a kind of a life model and a moral code, but less into the burning bush and sort of mystical stuff. Right. So that's where Jefferson is. And so, yes, I think he's writing from a place of understanding that there are lots of different ways someone can live a religious life and that government shouldn't be putting its thumb on the scale of those kinds of choices.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you think about founding figures like Jefferson, and we will talk about the complicatedness of this, but who are wrestling with the idea of what does liberty mean? Liberty of conscience, right? The state can't tell you what God to worship. They might have a favored religion at the sort of state level, but they can't disallow your religious beliefs because you have to have that kind of liberty of conscience. Of course, this does not extend to the people who Jefferson enslaved. And so, there are some complications with reaching back to Jefferson as kind of a model of what modern liberty should look like. But it was part of this kind of wrestling with what does real freedom and liberty look like. And if you're going to be establishing this new government on an idea of liberty, you have to figure out what that liberty means.
Yeah. So that is all very high-minded. And I think that these are high-minded folks and they wrestle with big ideas, but they are also, and I think it's so important to just remember, they are also, political actors living in a very different time and in a very different kind of political and cultural environment. And so, when we have Jefferson write these words that feel like they're part of the Constitution, that feel like they are establishing core tenets, what do we make of the fact that he didn't sort of argue for this phrase to be in the Constitution, or even sort of go out of his way to give a speech proclaiming this as part of a larger code? He writes it in a letter in January 1802 to the Connecticut Baptist Association to kind of mollify what seems to me like a little squabble that's taking place in the Pioneer Valley. What do we make of the fact that those epic words seem to appear in a kind of humdrum letter?
Well, I mean, he's helping to make part of what Jefferson is doing during both his presidency and over the course of his lifetime is to make the case for a particular reading of what the government should look like, a particular reading of the Constitution, a particular set of values that he's trying to promote. And in this case, you have this group of folks from different religions, all Protestant, in the Connecticut Valley. And they're upset because there is an established religion in Connecticut. The Connecticut colony was founded by Calvinist Protestants, and they felt that state religion infringed on their religious beliefs. And part of what Jefferson is doing is he's coming out and saying, well, I believe that they shouldn't do that. They have the right to do it because states are allowed to establish their own religion, but he's making a political case that they shouldn't be doing that because actual true liberty means that you have the right to practice your faith as you see fit. And he is also living in a time when how that hits the ear is very different than how it hits the ear today. Like, these are people who were living in a society, in a political world, in a cultural world in which religion was one of the defining institutions of government, of life, right? It's not being forbidden from celebrating Christmas or having Sundays off, having all sorts of laws on the books that restrict what you can do based on religious tenets. That was just part of how life was. It was the water in which people were swimming. And so when Jefferson is talking about a wall between church and state, that's not saying, that government should be devoid of any sort of religious content. He is trying to draw a line between two governing institutions that are expected to be governing institutions. The government is one and the church is another, and they just shouldn't be mixing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is the big idea that I kind of have been mulling around this story, and I think is so important to point out that I think now when people talk about that notion of separation between church and state, I think from religious folks, there's a sort of fear built in there that that separation also potentially indicates a diminishment of religion, right? And here, and I think there's just no element of that whatsoever in what Jefferson is writing here. And in fact, you know, it's honoring both sides equally by separating them. Whereas now, I think, you know, if you're coming from a place of religion is receding from American life, this notion of, well, our governing institutions need to be stripped of religion can be read as a threat in a way that I just don't think it would have in that time.
And we have evidence of that just in the story that you told in the introduction, which is a few days after writing this letter, Jefferson goes to a church service in the House of Representatives. That wasn't seen as a violation of this tenet of a separation of church and state, because it made sense that you would have this big public religious gathering, worship service in the middle of Congress. And that wasn't necessarily seen as a violation because it also allowed room for other religions.
Exactly.
Like just because you were having this religious service in the House of Representatives didn't mean that you were saying that Muslim people in the United States couldn't have religious services or Jewish people in the United States couldn't have religious services. That those things
they probably
still
would have said that.
Well, but not Thomas Jefferson, right?
Well, that's true.
There were real efforts, at least in some colonies and states, to be more religiously inclusive in that sense.
Yeah.
But it's but still in a context in which you would have a official state religion where things would be closed on Sundays and not Fridays or Saturdays, right? So it was still a very Christian Protestant world, but one that didn't necessarily persecute and prosecute people for their faith.
Yeah. But, and I'm being flip here, but, I think that it's important. It's worth sort of noting that it's kind of like the argument here is which flavor of Christianity are you choosing?
Yeah. Right.
Are you choosing religion or are you not? And I think to layer on the other kind of elements into this particular letter and the story of this letter, I referenced the kind of marginalia and the other elements of this letter that were erased or rephrased, as was, much of the Constitution, as were much of these early documents that now people have parsed over and over and over. Those also seem to indicate a kind of wrestling, but I would say wrestling along the margins of kind of this big question on behalf of Jefferson. So, for instance, just above the section where he proclaims this separation of church and state, there was a whole section that then Jefferson erased where he talked about how he had refused to proclaim national days of fasting and Thanksgiving as his predecessors, George Washington and John Adams, had. And he wrote that, and then he deleted it because he said he didn't want to offend, quote, our Republican friends in eastern states who cherish those days of fasting and Thanksgiving. I say that all to say that, clearly he's wrestling with, the political implications here, not just the big high-minded ideals, right? And it's what have my predecessors done? How have people before me wrestled with these questions? What's going to, mollify this group of churches in Connecticut and make them feel like I'm on their side, but also not piss off a whole group of people who I'm then going to have to deal with, in a month or two. It's all there, and I think the crafting of this letter clearly reflects that.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
And it is worth making this a letter that is a product of its time rather than just treating this church and state line as I don't know, like a timeless principle that was being spoken into the world that now constrains and shapes all of our ways of understanding jurisprudence around religion. I also, as we move into talking about how the life that church and state takes on, this is in 1802. This is a year before Marbury versus Madison establishes that the Supreme Court gets to interpret the Constitution. Well, like he was not writing into a world in which he was like, aha, I'm creating new originalist doctrine that is going to be interpreted by the Supreme Court in order to make sense of this. Although that is how this would then be used for
so let's jump to that. I mean, you talk about kind of not seeing this as establishing a huge kind of core principle of American life. Well, who decides that that's the case and who does sort of view these words that way? Well, it is the Supreme Court in 1947. This is where those words kind of get wedded, I would say, to the First Amendment, because there is a Supreme Court ruling. Justice Hugo Black writes in a 5-4 majority for Jefferson versus Board of Education that the First Amendment, citing these words by Jefferson, does establish a, quote, separation of church and state. And that ruling holds that neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. But, it does feel like that's the moment where people do take this line that was written in a random letter that, again, I'm diminishing it, but this line that was written in a random letter that Jefferson wrote in January of this year and say this was foundational language.
Right. And this is a hugely important decision that does things that I personally think are really important. It takes that idea of church and state, and it's not just talking at this point about the establishment of an official religion, but they go much, much further. And the Supreme Court rules that, you can't force a person or influence them to not go to the church of their choosing or to profess a belief or disbelief in a religion, that no tax can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions. And this is going to be then reflected in school prayer cases within the next 15 years or so that say you can't have mandatory school prayer. It's going to be reflected in the taxation policies around churches and religious schools that are going to be some of these hot button issues in the latter half of the 20th century. So this is a hugely important redefinition of what it means for the government not to be involved in religion. And I think a really important redefinition of it. What I find particularly interesting about this moment, though, is that the justices feel the need to reach back to 1802 in order to justify this definition of liberty. And that's, I think, what's actually important about this, is that it is part of a jurisprudence in which justices say, well, in order to make this claim about liberty and about what people should be allowed to do, we have to go, sort through the letters of founders in order to come up with what their definition of liberty is. And I'm a historian, right?
Yeah.
So I know that this is problematic, but I actually don't think that we need to read the tea leaves of the 18th century in order to decide what our values are and what constraints should be put on people's personal liberties and freedoms, in part because justices aren't historians and they make a hash of history whenever they get around it. But also it leads to things like this, where we're like pawing through the marginalia on a letter that's 250 years old, written by an enslaver, to decide what our liberties should look like. And I don't think that's a great idea.
That's very well said. I mean, it's kind of like in 1802, the argument was, which version of Christianity do you want? And in 1947, it's like, which interpretation of these 100-year-old words do you want? As opposed to, there might be another path, to just kind of like live in the moment and use these guiding principles to establish new law. But yes, no surprise. That is a big foundational moment, that ruling in the 40s. Immediately, it's contested. I mean, it was a 5-4 ruling, but, conservative justices and more religiously minded justices are kind of arguing that was a misinterpretation of what Jefferson was saying. It seems to me like the next kind of moment in the story of the interpretation of these words that are in that letter is now in the late 90s. And this really fascinating thing happens that, frankly, I think this could have been the sort of entry point to this story, because it is strange and forgotten and so fascinating. But what happens is basically someone at the Library of Congress starts to analyze this letter and starts to notice all of this marginalia, all these erased parts, all of this kind of wording, and starts to really understand the context. They basically push back and reframe and say, you know what, this actually wasn't really a letter about the foundation of law, but it's kind of a political document, and it's about winning political favor with these particular constituents in New England. The TikTok of how this all came together and came out, it's truly fascinating how this kind of new information about this letter comes out. And there's a really great, long scholarly article by the curator of this exhibit, sort of retelling and recounting the story of kind of what happened in the wake of trying to bringing this letter out of the dusty archives and put it on display. But there was a 1998 exhibit called Religion and the Founding of the American Republic. And they pulled out all these letters and so forth and found this Jefferson letter. And they realized that, there might be something to analyze here. And they called in the FBI, who had recently recovered blotted out passages in Teddy Roosevelt's diary. So they were like there were people at the FBI who were like, yeah, we know how to see the unwritten and blotted out and erased parts. And so they were like, take a look at this letter. They find this extra language. They kind of, it helps recontextualize. And at least according to the curator of this, there's going to be a big media day around this exhibition on June 1st, 1998 or something. And all the media has already been invited, and they've already printed the pamphlets with all the information about the exhibit. And then he's like, wait a minute, there's this new information about this one particular letter. And so he has to print a little supplemental piece of paper, that gets slotted into those pamphlets. Yep. And on there is where he kind of opens this Pandora's box of maybe this document was more of a political document than a foundational law and religious document. And it's just the idea that it was just this slipped in thing to kind of try and answer some questions for the press who were inevitably going to ask about the FBI investigation into this one letter. It's just so fascinating that then it kind of completely recasts this document, completely gets right at the heart of this foundational idea of separation of church and state, potentially undermines a 1940s ruling by Hugo Black, all because this one curator wanted to just kind of, go the extra mile.
Do scholarship on deadline, which is always tricky.
Exactly. And now all of a sudden, the religious right, to use that term, I think it probably exists at this point in the late 90s.
It does, yep.
The religious right comes out and says, aha, see, the Library of Congress just did a forensic analysis of this letter, and they've completely undermined this idea that Jefferson was arguing for a separation between church and state.
This is such a wild moment because, yes, this is a historian who's working for the Library of Congress. He's doing what at that point in time is a pretty normal mode of analysis for historians to look at the founders not as through the lens of ideas and ideology, but through the lens of hard politics and say, oh, well, this was actually to appease this faction and appease that faction. And this guy, it's not a footnoted, peer-reviewed article. It's just this thing that he's kind of throwing together for the display of this letter at the Library of Congress. And he doesn't think at all about the politics around this. And in the 1990s, the politics around this are pretty clear. By the 1990s, you have a conservative legal movement that is wedded to the idea of originalism. So something like that letter is catnip to this movement. And you have the Christian Coalition, which is an incredibly powerful part of the religious right, which is a term that comes into favor in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that is able to mobilize immediately as soon as they recognize this document. And so, of course, it becomes a touchstone for this fight. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of all of those attempts to X-ray the Shroud of Turin, right? Right, in order to decide was this actually the blood of Jesus? Is this the face of Jesus on this cloth? Because on the one hand, it's the application of all of these new techniques to try to understand a historical artifact, and as a historian, totally for that. On the other hand, there is this kind of mysticism that's driving it. If we could only see the original image, then we have this new insight into the thinking of the founders, and that then frees us or enables us to interpret the Constitution properly in this way that I think is maybe not the most useful in the world. But although I do encourage the recovery of old artifacts.
Right. Well, and to wrap up then, I think on that point, what is useful? I mean, on the one hand, I think I agree with you that yes, going into these hundreds-year-old letters and doing forensic analysis to find the thing to make the argument you were going to make anyway. How useful is that? But on the other hand, I'm like, well, you were going to make that argument anyway, so have at it, right? And I mean, these are like core fundamental arguments, and if it wasn't this letter, it would be something else.
I just think that puncturing the mysticism around all of this is ideal, so that when people do reach back across the centuries in order to say, aha, this man who owned slaves had this insight into freedom that we never realized before, we must bow down to this new discovery, that we can move ourselves out of that mindset and into something that's maybe a little more clear-eyed. That's my closing thought.
There you go. It's a great closing thought. And if anyone out there is a constitutional scholar or a Jefferson scholar or a religious scholar and wants to tell us what other wrinkles of this story we might want to follow up on, I mean, I do think the Bible that he remixed on his own is fascinating. Maybe we should do that as a standalone episode at some point. So let's leave that there. And then, as we often do at the end of the show, let's do some also on this days. So it is January 9th. And on this day in 1793, Frenchman Jean-Pierre Blanchard, using a hot air balloon, flew from Philadelphia to Woodbury, New Jersey. Doesn't seem that far, but in 1793, in a hot air balloon. Great job. I haven't looked it up. I should have looked it up. I'm sure there's a New Jersey Transit train that'll get you there in 27 minutes now. But anyway. Good for
Congratulations, Jean-Pierre. In 1913 on this date, Richard Milhouse Nixon was born in Yorba Linda, California, the 37th president of the United States, who would resign in disgrace.
In 1951, the United Nations headquarters in New York officially opened. Beautiful building, actually. Sneakily beautiful, in my opinion.
And in 1987, the White House released a memo prepared for President Ronald Reagan by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, showing a link between the U.S. arms sales to Iran and the release of American hostages in Lebanon. The Iran-Contra affair, which I now know way, way, way too much about.
Well, you want to tell folks? I mean, I think you know,
yes. Well, yeah. I have been doing a lot of research into Oliver North for a book that I am slowly starting to work on. So I have been in Ollie land for a while, and the number of memos where they're all like, here's our secret criminal conspiracy. Will the president please sign off on this? Is actually quite remarkable. North didn't manage to shred them all, so there's still some hanging around.
With the line from The Wire. Are you taking
notes on a criminal conspiracy?
Yeah, exactly. All right. We will leave it there with some also on this days. And folks, we'll tell you that the newsletter that we have at thisdaypod.com, you can sign up there. We're going to be relaunching that soon and really focusing on bringing you a bunch of these stories that happen in a given week, along with some original analysis. We're really excited about that as one of our big initiatives for 2024. So if there's one thing you come away from here, beyond Niki's beautiful thoughts about how we should treat the words of white men from many, many years ago, the other thought you should have is go sign up for the newsletter at thisdaypod.com. All right.
That's right.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.